Hey gang! While CIG is off on their winter break and then on to their planning sessions and they're coming back around February, I thought it might be fun to take a look at each of the game loops that we know about, or at least get through as many as I can. In each of these, I'll try to stay on a realistic target, even if the loops themselves are mostly just conjecture at this point. So first up, how about second up, since I already did the salvaging one? Second up, let's tackle a loop that we know almost nothing about. Thought that this might be fun, the science loop. This sounds fun? Let's get this. So if there's one loop in this game that is more mysterious and misunderstood than any other, it's probably the Science Gameloop. Part of that is on CIG. Just in the early days, when the game was first being sketched out, loops and how they'd eventually work were just bare sketches filled with gaps, and the backers were more than happy to fill those gaps with anything imaginable. Over the years, especially with the science loop, hints have been dropped, but there's a very real chance that even on the CIG drawing boards, the science loop is still just a bare sketch. I've included the links to most of what CIG has said in the description below, and most of that is just the Endeavor design doc and the Q&A. There's been a couple tidbits dropped here and there, but they're not enough to actually go through and mash together one or two words from a bunch of videos over 10 years. So with that said, this mild speculation will probably be more of a shorter one, with me taking a stab at what I think this loop's niche will be, as well as how I think it'll work, given what we know about this project as a whole and how CIG typically does game loops in general, with the two examples we have so far. First, let's start with what we know, and that all starts with the ships that have been tapped for the science loop. All two of them. The Endeavor and this guy, the Reliant Sen. Actually, let's start with what the science loop probably won't be. As said, there's been a ton of speculation over the years, so let's take a little step back. As said earlier, when CIG left gaps in what they had planned for this loop, backers filled in those gaps with all kinds of expectations, not all of them realistic. So let's start there. Many people in those early days, especially when the concept for the Endeavor dropped, would immediately start jumping to conclusions just based on the concept images of these ships. The Reliant Sen had a microscope in it, so we'd definitely be looking at things under a microscope, for example. The Endeavor had a huge radio telescope, and they even had this video, so we'd definitely be watching celestial events, that sort of thing. I'm not saying that CIG won't eventually have some sort of element of that gameplay, just that it's unlikely to be the focus or in the first tier. So what do I think the Science Gameloop will encompass? Put simply, recipes. Recipes for crafting, recipes for healing, recipes for making improvements to components, things like that. Given how CIG has implemented their game loops so far, we can take some educated guesses on how this will work. I figure, just based on the way other games work, there will probably be about 4 steps involved here. This step, like many of the first steps, seems obvious. A lot like the mild speculation on the salvage loop, the first step in this loop might not even be carried out by a would-be scientist. Instead, someone goes out and finds a thing. Eventually, hopefully, they bring that thing to someone with the science gear and says, "Look at this neat crap I found." Hopefully, but maybe not, this won't be literal. Again, this is something that could fall into the Explorer loop, which I'll get to one of these days. And once again, the loop will probably start with an Explorer, an info runner. Just given that a lot of Explorers will probably double dip with science, especially those that have sprung for the massive Endeavor specifically to engage in exploring and sciencing stuff, I could see there being a lot of cross-pollination between those two loops. But anyways, step 1, bring the scientist the stuff to science. This is where things start getting hazy. Once the scientist gets the thing, how do they research it? Will they actually use a microscope? I seriously doubt it, because how would that even work? Beams? Well, I mean, yes, it'll probably be beams. Of course it'll be beams. But some other ideas, and again, this is pure conjecture on my part, CIG could take advantage of protein or molecule folding games. Spectral analysis, pattern recognition, there's some options here. And a lot like Salvage, there are whole games out there that do nothing else. Also like Salvage, this is an opportunity for CIG to appeal to a player base that currently isn't in the game, but might be enticed to buy into the game if there was actually a gameplay loop for them. Honestly, protein folding could be pretty visually appealing and pretty unique in this genre. So it's not totally ridiculous that CIG would go in a direction like that. That said, do I think it'll be more complicated than hold down left mouse button while the beam melts the thing? Yeah, eventually. Probably. Once the thing has been studied, there might be information the scientists can glean from it. I would certainly hope so. There might be hints about what that thing could be combined with or what it could be used for in an original or unique sense. Of course, the key to recipes is combining stuff, so let's focus on that. The real question will be how these recipes will be original. The problem is that if this were a single-player game, it would just be part of the progression ramp, and probably an optional one at that. But in a multiplayer game, particularly a massively multiplayer game, once somebody figures out that combining Agricium with Rantadung makes this really cool metal you can use to upgrade ship engines or some crap, literally, that'll be it. Everyone who's remotely following the game's details and science will know that piece of information. So the challenge here for CIG will be coming up with a way to make the process of sciencing stuff unique enough that researching a recipe could produce a slightly different result. How will that be balanced out? No clue. But that said, I wasn't the one that started hyping up this loop back in 2014. Reap what you sow. You could just have a giant list of things that are combinable, some with catastrophic result. Shit goes boom, in other words. That add an element of risk to just randomly throwing things together to see what happens. From a list of things that aren't catastrophic combinations, and maybe those too, depending on the application, there could be a bunch of desirable results. Maybe nothing game-breaking, but desirable. Slightly stronger armor, maybe ship skin that's slightly more resistant to wear and tear, a cure for some disease that's running through the verse. This could be balanced out by having the good recipes require combining more rare materials and require a much more difficult game of protein folding or whatever. Again, this would seem to be more of a thing you'd find in a single-player game. Once someone knows that 3 parts Rantadung and 1 part Agricium produces X, then everyone else will know that they just need that combo of stuff and they have it. So again, the challenge is this. How do you make it so that once a recipe is found, other people would still need to go through the process in order to get that recipe? Again, I think the trick would be adding in mild variances. So this recipe might produce more resistance to wear and tear, but less resistance to, say, ballistic weapons. You get the idea. One recipe, X and thing Y, and maybe thing Z, A, B, C, and so on, could have a lot of different variations based on the theme. Minor tweaks to how the protein is folded could have profound or even small results in the final product. And again, I think the problem is that you'll bump into the fact that this loop will be finite, and the number of recipes will have to be finite in response. That said, I could see people endlessly tweaking the protein folding or whatever to try to get that balance in the recipe, or find one that didn't exist previously. Of course, this will require CIG to come up with a way to put an envelope over it so it can produce something truly broken. But beyond that, come up with a system of things that combine and things that combination can impact and let the community go wild. And then you have the variance in the whole gameplay of the folding the protein that would just produce very minor results one way or the other. I could talk about the telescope here, which I'm still dubious about, but I think that one might make more sense when I talk about the exploration game loop. So moving on. Beyond the research part, the next part would be easy, selling or using the recipes. Depending on what it is, whether it's a new fuel type or the cure for some disease or virus that CIG releases in some event, and yeah, they've actually specifically mentioned exactly that in the past, it'll be a matter of getting that recipe to the next link, the next loop in the chain. This could be a refiner, a medic, a drug dealer, allegedly, you get the idea, or just selling it to an info runner. So what does this make the Science Gameloop? I think it'll be like repair or medical or hacking in the sense they'll be relegated to more of a support loop, a loop that you do in addition to another one. So someone who's an engineer might also dabble in recipes to spruce up an engine Scotty style. Or a medic might do it to come up with new cures or new ways to make med pens. But again, the problem that I see with recipes is that you kind of get stuck in that law of diminishing returns. But if you make that protein folding minigame good enough, and the variances it produces interesting enough, you might have people that would just do nothing else but sit and play the protein folding game. CIG could always introduce a new resource here and there to spice everything up and turn it all on its head, making old recipes obsolete as the new stuff comes in. In this sense, I think of SAS Factory with that. There's loads of ways to make a factory in that game, and some are less efficient, but equally cool. I could see science being similar. Maybe. One day. Hey, I told you this one would be mostly short and mostly conjecture. And that's all I have for this one, gang. Let me know what you think down below. Catch me next time.